The figures come along nicely up to this point. Now we get into the fun stuff. Before any kind of painting can occur, we must prepare the surface. Plastics are quite smooth at a micro level. Without any kind of surface tooth to grab onto, paint will struggle to adhere to the surface. Even if you manage to force it on, it will be unstable and prone to flaking. So we must first stabilize the surface with something that can grip onto the substrate and create a surface receptive to painting, aka primers, of which there are two types, rattle cans and airbrush primers. The main advantage with rattle cans is the volume of paint they spray and the adherence to the surface. These contain a volatile cocktail of solvents that give them a good grip on a variety of materials. They are best used to prime a lot of models at once, or to prime a very large sculpt. Airbrush primers contain various chemicals that give a greater degree of stick to a substrate. They additionally have a consistent finish to give yourself a good starting point to work from. There are a few made by companies such as Stylorez and Vallejo, but I have found them difficult to use. They separate a lot in the bottle. I can never get them to not clog my airbrush when I stop for more than 5 seconds. For this job, I found Molotov paint to be quite effective. Originally for graffiti markers, these paints stick quite well to a wall as much as they do a miniature. Their One For All Black is my go-to for 99% of my work, as it is very fluid and flowing through the airbrush. It also has a nice satin finish that takes paint well. The main advantage with an airbrush primer is that you have full control of the process of what goes where, as well as the flow of the paint, giving you a guaranteed smooth finish every time. A rattle can is much more susceptible to random errors, but until you possess this tool, you're kinda stuck with them. In the process of priming a figure, you may notice previously invisible mold lines or other manufacturing artifacts. This is normal. Sometimes it takes the finish of a primer to bring out these artifacts, and there's simply not much to be done about it. Just sand them away as best as you can, as usual, and prime again. One of the strengths of airbrush primers is that you can quickly fix errors without having to wait for a dry day to sit the box out outside. While it may seem frustrating to have to go back and fix errors such as this, know that it's simply part of the process. Don't be so hard on yourself to fix simple errors like this one. Yeah, an unfortunate thing with resin, it tends to be a bit fragile. Thankfully this piece broke pretty clean and will be simple to repair. For now I leave the tail aside and focus on refining my prime job. I continue to work away at my gap filling and improving the finish of the prime. It may seem boring to have to go through all this work over and over again. Don't worry, it is, but it's necessary work. We speak of the painting process in segmented steps to facilitate learning, but any long-term project has moments of going back and fixing things, going forward, and then going back again. It's simply part of the work. After a while, I feel comfortable with the base sculpt and the overall prime. I stick the head on for the next step, but keep it unglued. I want the option to work on the head by itself later, as faces are a natural focal point for any humanoid sculpt, and are thus deserving of more attention and care. With the base coat of black primer set down, you could start the painting process right now, but I highly recommend you start with an underpainting before you commit to anything just yet. I've spoken about this before, but I feel it's worth going into more depth with here. Underpainting is exactly what it sounds like, a painting underneath the surface of the real painting. It is, in a blurb, a guide for your future painting endeavors. Just as a drawing begins with a basic layout of where the basic masses lie, a sketch, underpainting is a tonal, black and white, rendering of a picture with a focus on rendering volumes and masses. This practice is most widely known as a grisaille. We often consider realism to be a function of good coloring, and marvel at a painting's remarkable color display. But more often than not, it is the painting's internal lights and darks, its tonal relationships, that's doing all the heavy lifting. Is it any wonder then why a black and white photograph, despite containing no color at all, has a healthy amount of realism to it? And with that line of logic, if your painting looks good in black and white, then it will look great with colors added in. While possible to create a grisaille in purely black and white, it is a good strategy to add in a neutral tone. The overall presence of a neutral earth color will give the whole painting a sense of visual cohesiveness. Here, I'm using iron oxide as my color, but burnt umber, raw umber, burnt sienna, or any other deep desaturated tone works for this. The grisaille begins with a general mid-coat of black and red, just to give myself a different starting point than pure black. I quickly set to work with a pink tone and begin loosely defining my volumes. In these early stages, I don't want to commit too heavily to any one particular definition. I'm more setting the ambient light of the scene, and to display some of the volumes of the sculpt in clearer focus for myself. I begin intensifying the light and defining the various shapes of the sculpt, carefully working up in tonality. Seeing basic shapes and forms in sculpts is one of the most fundamental parts of artistic thinking. By abstracting some of the sculpt's volumes into more baseline geometric forms, you can quite faithfully recreate what they would look like if an in-universe light were to shine upon them. A leg is not just a leg shape, but a cylinder. And if you understand how a cylinder reacts with light, then you know how to light a leg, and by extension, any other cylinder. Working with an airbrush, you gain a lot of expediency, especially with a female model, which benefits from a softer transition. It is not, however, a magic bullet that people think it is. There are some processes that are made significantly easier and, more importantly, faster with it. Base coating and glazing come to mind, as these are processes that are very time intensive and their execution done better with this tool. But the airbrush has only one action, the atomization of paint. It is not as versatile as the variety of brushes out there. It is an excellent tool and very much worth the time and money that you invest into it, but its effects can be replicated with any proper brush technique and some more time added in. To establish some of these textures, I set about the creation of my palette of 3 tones. To create the variety of different textures I want to use a variety of different brushes. When brushes become old or damaged, don't just toss them, they have potential still. A ragged brush with a frayed hair may be useless for applying smooth strokes, but excellent in making leather, or even just applying PVA glue to bases. This old brush here has some very nice hairs left to create lines with. While the creation of this texture is likely to get lost in the future painting, this preliminary work does 2 things. 1. It starts in familiarizing me to the various textures of the sculpt. Cloth, skin, metals, plastics, all have a specific texture and reaction to the light that must be brought out. Here, I focus on creating the textural sensation of the obfuscation of colors. Even if I work over them in my real painting stage, it's good to lay out some information for myself now, so I don't have to make as many decisions later, only focusing on execution of things I know are already working. Second, with only 3 colors to work with, fixing mistakes is much easier now than later. We only need to focus on rendering volumes, light, and texture. Color adds a great deal of life, but it also adds a great deal of complexity. Going back and fixing something at this stage means avoiding a more challenging issue down the line. It is akin to realizing an issue within the foundation of a house while the framing is still occurring versus when the drywall has been installed. Once certain structures have been established, going back to fix more integral problems of the base forms becomes that much more challenging. The shoes are a good example of this textural thinking. I think of these being made of some kind of suede leather, which is a strong start for those curious in textures, as it is very forgiving and variable in appearance, making even rudimentary renditions of it still appear realistic and convincing. The material is naturally scuffed and scratched, and you can create this effect quite easily with a sponge. Simply dip the sponge and scratch or pat it around to create the natural chaos of a worn surface. And of course, you can use a brush to create the appearance of more distinct scratches. The sponge is a great tool to create random textures, as we have easy access to them in our field. I keep all of mine for the models I buy just for this reason. Some have fine texture, some are looser. In changing which ones you use and tearing them up in different ways, you can create some very nice chaotic looking effects. For each identifiable surface on the model, I prescribe it a texture. Things such as the clothing and shoes are fairly easy, but others are not so apparent. Hair is a frequent stumbling point. The best way I would describe to do hair is to treat it like metal and to simplify it as much as you can. Hair has a natural luster that is frequently attributed with things like copper and gold, so treating it more like a metallic surface will get you closer to the real appearance. Use a large soft brush and try not to highlight every single detail, lest you make the hair appear like a string mop and not as a loose collection of highlights. I moved to the dry palette and set about giving the piece a bit of visual movement with some brushstrokes. It's frequently thought that a sign of fine craftsmanship in miniatures is the complete absence of these. This illustrious, perfect smoothness that artists such as Andy Warhol are so well known for. This is no doubt a beautiful sign of brush control and technique, but I suspect this value judgment is more of a reflection of the painter's ability rather than as aesthetic preference or technical rationale. Rendering fine transitions is a technique that many people struggle with, as they are still trying to understand their paint and how to apply it in a controlled manner. Upon the sight of a piece of fine transitions, they exclaim, "Ah, now this is miniature painting!" This is an understandable opinion, but one based in naivete. For much of art history, there was this strong emphasis on fine rendering, this perfect smoothness. But even in this era of strong representation, paint strokes were present. However, they would not be the star of the show for many years. It would take the invention of metal tubes for the paint stroke to come full center. With the rise of commercially available paint, an artist no longer needed a full studio and equipment to set about their work. Paint was readily available on demand and in quantity. With this development, we see Impressionists use the brushstroke to full effect, and with it, new visual sensations and movements were available. To state a painting's smoothness as the mark of its quality is to dismiss the works of Monet, Van Gogh, or Sargent. Even classical masters like Rembrandt were great users of the brushstroke. That is enough reason to consider them not as an enemy, but as a tool, one that can be learned and utilized. In my case, I'm using these strokes on the legs to throw the eye upwards, as the natural striations of the overlapping paint strokes will create some lines that give the piece visual movement for where I want the viewer to look. This thinking is hugely important and very much worth your time and effort studying. However, to fully discuss that, we'd had to get into the real painting of this, which is good, as the grisaille is now complete. You can see now that this piece, while a bit dull in the color department, still reads quite effectively. There is a sense of logic to where the light and dark colors lie, differences in the various surfaces, and some direction of the eye with brushstrokes. The sketch of the painting is complete, and the plunge into color comes next. Take care, and have a good one.